Welcome back. My name is Roy Childs and this is part 2 of a series of videos entitled Should Coaches Use Psychometrics? In the previous video, I addressed some of the issues and misunderstandings regarding psychometrics. In this video, I want to make the case for reframing psychometrics away from the hard measurement paradigm and towards a more psychological paradigm. This means understanding how we use different clues as evidence about ourselves and others, which includes what we say, what we do, and how quickly we realise that we may have changed. But since psychometrics involves metrics, i.e. numbers, we first need to clarify something I touched on in the previous video, namely the difference between hard and soft numbers. So what do I mean by hard and soft numbers? To some, hard numbers are represented by complex equations, but more specifically, hard numbers need to represent some meaningful quantity. We sometimes assume this is the case when in fact it is not. So let me illustrate what I mean. Will Schutz, author of The Phiro and the Human Element, ran a series of self-awareness workshops for NASA, who had identified a clear issue about lack of openness. The workshops were designed to increase, yes, openness, inclusivity and honesty. And to evaluate their effectiveness, participants were asked to answer this question: how open are you? Well, in fact, it was a little more sophisticated than that, and they were asked to complete element O, which is a survey that summarises how open people perceive their culture to be. So here are the results. This was the average before the workshops. And how much did it change? It was hoped that it would move to here. However, the results were a significant drop in score. In other words, participants reported being less open after the workshops than before. This suggests failure, but more qualitative feedback revealed how participants had raised the bar. Their previous understanding of openness was saying what you think. Their new understanding recognised that saying what you think can often be a personal defensive reaction. Real openness required much more self-understanding, courage and honesty, and are willing to own your own mistakes. So in fact, the drop in score represented an increase in openness, but the benchmark had changed. This does present difficulties in interpreting self-report scores. But once we acknowledge that a 5 is not always more than a 4, we become far more circumspect about drawing inferences from self-report questionnaires. We must continue to remind ourselves that the self-report scores are not hard numbers, although unfortunately they are often treated as if they were. And the other issue we must keep in mind is that the meaning of the words we use can be different for different people at different times. And so, in the rest of this video, we can explore in more depth the 3 considerations I referred to in the previous videos, and these were about the value of words, is what we say who we really are, the value of behaviour, is what we do really who we are, and then an important question, do we change, and is who we were necessarily who we are now? So let me begin with the value of words. What do they tell us? Think how you would rate this statement, I like change. On a scale of 1 disagree to 5 agree, what would you give it? And now consider these 3 people who all rated it 5, but ask them why, and we get these answers. One says, I like to wear new clothes every day. Another one says, I want to get a new job every year. And another one says, we need to overthrow the government. Given that they all have very different concepts in mind, how can we interpret one person's 5 versus another person's 5? Words are not numbers, they are fuzzy sets. Their meanings overlap and people's understandings diverge. Plus, they all use different benchmarks. The results are therefore soft numbers, and not easily comparable. This has led me to reframe what self-report really reveals. And one way I like to approach it is as follows. The meaning of a person's verbal reply to a question in a questionnaire is a puzzle to be understood rather than an answer to be interpreted or a prediction to be made. And further, people who use self-report questionnaires should try using two words much more. I wonder. I wonder what that would mean. This helps us to approach a person's results with curiosity. We become the guide on the side, not the sage on the stage. We are no longer expert interpreters, but curious explorers, trying to unravel the meaning behind the words. This leads me to think differently about what we are doing when we ask someone to complete a questionnaire. We are in effect saying, tell me about yourself. Now that can be done in a variety of ways. For example, that's what we're doing in an interview, or in a casual or an intimate chat. However, the advantage of a questionnaire is that it is, metaphorically, like a kaleidoscope. A chat can ask many questions which reveal many elements, but these elements are relatively unstructured. We get meaning from them by listening selectively and choosing and attending to things according to our own biases. The advantage of a questionnaire, though, is like the kaleidoscope, you can twist all those elements and they then form a pattern which has known characteristics. This is what allows us to add suggestions, to make inferences, or to add a new perspective, especially if the questionnaire fits into a wider body of knowledge or theory. But I have another way of thinking about self-report questionnaires. My observation in the field of human relationships is that people are not often given a chance to explore themselves and to communicate their thoughts to others, or at least not often enough. My evidence goes beyond casual observation. It comes from running many workshops. Whenever I give people a chance to talk about themselves, we always run out of time. So this leads to another metaphor for the role of the questionnaire. They are like giving people a microphone. It enables them to speak, to be heard. And there is the other side of the coin, because people often hear what they are saying to themselves more clearly. In other words, we are helping people to think, see and hear themselves as they write their own autobiographical narrative. So I hope this demonstrates how I can see great value in self-report, even if it does not meet the criteria of a hard measurement paradigm. And this brings me to the second consideration I mentioned earlier. If words are so problematic, should we focus on behaviour? Is what I do really who I am? Some approaches to questionnaire design recommend that all the questions should be behavioural. Unfortunately, this has its own shortcomings. So let me illustrate again from my own experience. Some years ago, I had the opportunity to work with what were called women returners, women who had taken time out from a job or career to raise a family. And the overriding issue for them was confidence, encapsulated in the fairly common comment, I am just a housewife. Now, of course, we can reframe that as being an expert in child development with a very demanding role, requiring lots of energy and working very long hours, but the reality is that what we do is limited by where we are, by our circumstances, our context, our opportunities. Hence, simply observing people in situ shows us part of who they are, but not what else they could do or could be. We are in fact caged by our experience and context, and I will say more on that later. So what does behaviour tell us about a person? Our questionnaires are trying to map things like values, personality, interests, all things that we think of as being inside the person, our personality, our identity. And clearly, these affect how we behave. But we are also influenced by our context, what is happening in our environment. In fact, there is often a dynamic tension between the demands of my situation and the demands of my inner being, which can be thought of as a kind of tug of war, and behaviour is the consequence of this battle. Hence, it is not hard evidence that defines a human character. Of course, it is an important one, but limited if we do not understand the context. Those of you with a background in psychology will recognise that the focus on behaviour has been a dominant school in psychology, beginning with Pavlov and going through various stages of sophistication. But those with a behaviourist orientation would strongly argue that questionnaire items should be behavioural and unambiguous. However, once we acknowledge that behaviour emerges as a tension between the inside and the outside, we need a way to strip out behaviour that is contextual. Unfortunately, the orthodox psychometric approach does not do that. Consider any questionnaires you may have done. Did they ask you things like what you do typically, or think of yourself in the average of situations? These instructions encourage an unclear mix of behaviour across contexts, leading to some kind of average self, which is insensitive to people's natural adaptation to circumstances. Once we acknowledge that behaviour emerges from the tension between the inside and the outside, we need a different approach that recognises the difference between contextual behaviour and inner preference. In addition, most questionnaires ask you to give the first answer that comes to you. This is an odd idea, but almost universal. It does not encourage deeper reflection, and the result is some generalised or decontextualised person or self. I am proposing that the acknowledgement of context is long overdue, and I am not alone in that. It is an issue for mainstream psychology as well. To support this position, I refer you to the book by Professor Jerome Kagan, Psychology's Ghosts. I was heartened to see the title of the very first chapter, Missing Context. This is something that deserves much more attention and which I will address more fully in part 3. I am making the case for widening our frame of reference to include the inner and the outer, and to recognise the limitations of current models, that neither words nor behaviour give sufficient evidence on which to build tools that measure a person's personality or their identity. There is a good argument for saying what I do is not who I am, or certainly not everything that I could be. I now want to move on to the third consideration, which was, do we change? And if so, what changes? This is a perennial question, and it does also feed into the old nature-nurture controversy. And here I am not going to take a position in that debate, primarily because it is a lot more complicated than I can do justice to here. But I am arguing for a new paradigm, one that acknowledges people's ability to be both flexible, but also to undergo significant change, at times and in some ways. So part of the new paradigm I'm proposing is that we don't keep looking backwards. Both behaviorism, represented by B.F. Skinner here, and psychoanalysis, as represented by Freud, both of these take a reductive view. They try to explain by precedent. They are attempting to explain how I became who I am today. Now, of course, this has value, but people developers often want to adopt a more forward-looking view, and few people realise that another iconic figure from the world of psychology, Carl Jung, did exactly that. His approach is a more constructivist approach. He believed that people are driven by purpose, and that purpose is what then helps us to shape our own future. So he is interested in what we are becoming rather than how I became who I am. Now, those who know Jung from his theory of psychological type may find this a bit of a surprise, because his typology is often misconstrued as an innate anchor from which we cannot escape. However, If you read psychological type, you would discover that he saw type as a compass, a guide from where we are now to where we are going. Jung was far more interested in what we are becoming than how we had become. For some, that does not fit with their somewhat narrow and misconceived view of a rigorous and scientific approach, but its value for people developers is huge. From what I've said, it should be clear that some approaches focus on how I became and others on becoming. Psychometrics has tended to be stuck in the became camp. Coaches, on the other hand, are more interested in the becoming concept. Can psychometrics help that in some way? I will propose ways in which it can do that better in part 3. But before that, I've already been alluding to my third consideration. Do we change? Obviously, becoming involves change, so let me introduce you to yet another metaphor, which is also an exercise that can be used with a wide range of people. Think of yourself as a book, and now write down the title of your current chapter, the first thing that pops into your head. And if you want to pause the video to give yourself a bit more time, please do so. When you've done that, write down the number of that chapter. And when you've done that, finally, write down how many chapters you think are in your book. I have used this exercise as a very useful way of helping people think about who they are, what they were, and what they will or see themselves becoming. It does not abandon the backwards-looking bias mentioned earlier, but it adds a clear focus on what next, the future. Could psychometrics help with that process more, given that it focuses so much on stability, and that focus on stability is further encouraged by getting people to give the first answer that comes to them when they answer a questionnaire? When they do that, they very often give their old stereotype, what they were, a previous chapter. I believe that psychometrics can do much more to help people look forward as well, but that again is for part 3 of this series. So, do we change? And if so, what actually changes? Is it slight shifts, or is it a metamorphosis? This is a fundamental question and fuels the nature-nurture debate. How much are we programmed by our genes? Without entering into that debate, there is one thing we need to remember. The focus in current psychometrics is on the things that don't change. But no amount of linking self-report to neuroscience changes the reality that a self-report questionnaire does not measure our DNA. It measures a person's self-view and helps them to tell their story as they see it and given their current level of awareness. And people's stories can and do change, sometimes minimally, sometimes significantly. A coach's role is to help them to manage that change, in effect, to write the next chapter of their book, something that is possible, but it is not always easy. And so finally, let me recap on why I use questionnaires. Earlier, I mentioned that there were 4 stages, and I found these useful. I also mentioned there would be a 5th. Well, the 5th is the word dynamic. Now, that fits with the direction I am taking with psychometrics, which is to help people with becoming, and that does depend on people wanting to change and build their new narrative, but it also has another meaning. If you think about using the words I mentioned earlier, like I wonder what the questionnaire has to say. What we find is it is like bringing another party into the room. It changes the focus, it changes the dynamics of our session, and for that reason it can be extremely useful. So let me summarize what we have covered in this video. We need to be cautious when we interpret questionnaires, first of all because the numbers are soft and not hard. Also, the words, that we use can have very different meanings for different people. We know that behaviour is not always an insight into the inner person, and we need context to make sense of what people do and say. Now, some things may not change, but we are dealing with people's story about themselves, which can and does change. And used well, psychometrics provides stimulus for that exploration. But I would like to leave you with some words from someone far more eloquent than I when he said, "The past is prologue, what to come is yours and my discharge, a clear focus on the future and becoming." Given the content of this video, I don't want to leave the impression that psychometrics as currently used do not add value. They clearly can. And when used well, they provide very useful stimulus in 4 key ways. They provide structure. That means that they help to organize the things that people say about themselves in useful ways, and that is more useful when it is linked to a wider body of theory. They also help to identify those aspects of a person that are less changeable. This can be useful to know, since as people developers, we need to know what aspects are harder to change, as long as we don't mistake the stability of a person's self-report for some constitutional structure. There's also the fact that we can make comparisons. Even though questionnaires produce soft numbers, and that involves therefore different understanding of the words and different levels of their benchmarks, it is still interesting and useful to know how one person has answered compared to others. And finally, they provide a basis for looking at evidence. The fact that questionnaires produce numbers makes it possible to research links to other measurable attributes, thus building an evidence base, as long as this kind of validity is not misused. So I hope that has been food for thought. But it is now time to move on, beyond the limitations and the history, and in the next video I will address ways in which psychometrics can evolve to address some of these issues, and hence to add more value, by acknowledging that context does affect behaviour, by introducing ways to challenge the current self-view, and by incorporating third-party feedback in a constructive way. Thank you for listening, and by all means send me your thoughts and comments with the details on the right-hand side. But do then, if you're interested in using psychometrics in a new way, seek out my next video, which is Should Coaches Use Psychometrics Part 3, Proposing Solutions. Thank you.